I just want to say a few things about myself, the group, but also opens with some remarks that hopefully we should lay the foundations for the conversations that you're going to have today. One of the things that Amjad said is that we are part of the European Conservative Reformist group. And one of the things I was determined when I became leader was that we're not going to just tell people what we're against, we're going to tell people what we are for. We're going to propose alternative solutions. And so actually this conference today is one of those conversations about, yes, we are against, or we want to challenge many of the existing education systems, or make you think about education in a different way. But we're not just against stuff, we want to talk about actually positive alternatives. One of the reasons that I was very grateful to Amjad for asking me to speak here today is because it brings together three of my passions. It brings together education, it brings together, in some ways, tackling poverty, and it brings together technology. And let me talk about each of those. Education, for me, clearly has been very important since a child. Anyone who's grown up in an immigrant family will know how much education is pushed down or is emphasized. Some would say shoved down your throat, but it actually means your parents want you, and most parents want their children to do better than they did. My father came to Britain in the 1950s. He worked on the railways and he worked on the buses. He didn't want me to do the same thing. He wanted me, in his words, to do better, the next generation to do better. He still lectures me. He's 85 years old. It was his birthday last week. I rang him up and said, "Happy birthday, Dad." And he said, "Let me remind you, son, your children must do better than you." And I thought, oh, all right, Dad, okay, I'll remember that. So he's still lecturing me at this age. Also, I was a lecturer. I used to teach. And one of the challenges for teaching is actually, particularly in universities, is how you engage students, particularly when you walk into a lecture theatre with rows and rows of hundreds of students. And I used to go on courses and think and read books and read online about actually how you engage students, how you break them up into groups, how you make it more innovative. And when I finish here in March, one of the offers I've had is to go back and be a professor. So for me, this is a bit of a rehearsal, if you like. Also, my wife was in education. Whereas I was teaching postgraduate students at university, my wife was teaching right at the other end of the age spectrum, the Montessori nursery. So we used to talk quite a lot about education at home and how you engage children and how you engage pupils at all sorts of age levels. The second passion of mine is how you tackle poverty and how you tackle social exclusion. I'm only a couple of generations away from poverty. And so when I hear these stories of my relatives growing up in poverty, and I see poverty in my own country, I want to know what can we do to tackle social exclusion. And if you read most research, lots of research says education is a path out of poverty. And this was summed up, sadly, by a former education secretary for the United Kingdom, when he said, sadly, in our country, rich, thick kids still do better than poor, clever kids. And so that's something that we have to think about when we're looking at actually making sure that we exploit, or not only exploit, but actually make sure that each individual, whether child or adult, achieves their ambition or actually achieves the best that they can do. And the third, if you like, passion for me is technology. I was a geek. I am now the father of geeks. I love technology. I love the way that people talk, particularly during this time when with scandals around Facebook and Google and collecting data and privacy. But people forget the positive impact that technology can have on our lives. To think about the way that the potential for technology to change not only education but also to tackle issues like social exclusion and those issues. Now, on top of that, think about how we teach. In some ways, when I go into a lecture theatre, is it really much different to the way the Victorians taught? In some ways, the technology behind me may have changed. It might have gone from a blackboard to a whiteboard to a smart board to overhead projectors and PowerPoints or whatever over the years. But actually, we teach in very much the old-fashioned way. And one of the things I think is really exciting in academia and discussions is actually understanding the way people learn and the different ways people learn. And actually how we challenge that in terms of, does it always have to be this old-fashioned way, the way I'm talking to you now? Now, I know that academics disagree on the number of different categories of learning, and if you just Google or look at research papers, there are challenges. Are there 3 ways of learning? Are there 4 ways of learning? Are there 7 ways of learning? Are there 8 ways of learning? But actually, it doesn't matter what the number is. What matters is that we recognize that individuals, pupils, people learn differently and have different techniques. And I'm sure we can all think of examples when someone has been doing badly at a subject, but you've changed the learning technique and suddenly they've done well. In my own life, I remember at school, learning one of the languages I learned at school was Russian. I remember my first year I struggled. But when I took Change Teacher and Change Textbook, suddenly I went from a C student to an A student in Russian. And that was just down to teaching techniques and the interaction with a teacher. I have seen pupils in my own constituency of London who've done badly at their school, but then they've gone to online tuition colleges, and they've gone from E students to A students. So it just shows it depends on how the student or the individual learns, as opposed to this old-fashioned technique that we still continue to this day in some ways, because it's more efficient. One teacher in front of lots of pupils. So that's what I think is really, really exciting. The other thing for me is actually I've been inspired the more I've discussed and talked and debated education. And two people that stand out for me in many ways, I just want to say, one is a guy called Siddhartha Mitra. Many of you will know the hole-in-the-wall experiment. Anyone who's heard him speak or actually gone online and read about it will just can't fail to be inspired. Putting a kiosk into the middle of a slum and just standing back and just letting the young kids in that village teach each other, actually use intuitive learning to use those kiosks and do some amazing things, often without a keyboard. And some of the stories are not only funny, but they're inspirational. The other person that has inspired me, or the work they've done, is Professor James Tooley, who's written about private schools for the poor. That's counterintuitive to a lot of people. What do you mean private schools for the poor? But what he found in his work was that when he went to some African countries and went to parts of India, what they had found is that sadly, in many areas, the state schools were not doing their jobs. Sadly, teachers either weren't turning up, or when they did turn up, they were making their students make tea, as opposed to teaching them. And what do the parents do? The parents of poor families made a sacrifice. Maybe it wasn't going to the cinema that week. Maybe it was something else. They gathered their pennies and they paid for their children to be educated. Now, when we talk about private education for the poor, it doesn't mean steel and glass complexes and modern office blocks. Quite often it's a simple building or a simple room in a village or in a slum. And you see these private schools. And what was inspirational was that the parents were voting with their feet. And if the school wasn't providing education, these schools would close down pretty quickly. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only way. It's one way. It's one way when you think of education and you think of a system of education rather than an education system. Different solutions for different students, for different circumstances. And it shouldn't necessarily be about state versus private. Actually, in my country, I'm very proud in London that actually our state education system has improved. And I think that's great. But we've got to remember, if we really believe in no child left behind, and I would add to that, no adult left behind, because I think one of the great sectors that is fascinating and under sort of celebrated, if you like, is the further education sector. That sector where people who have not done well first time, maybe because they came from a poor background, maybe because they didn't have the guidance, are given a second chance, a third chance, a fourth chance for education. Very inspirational when I go and meet many of the further education colleges in my patch in London. So when we put together these ideas, I think it's amazingly exciting for you to just, when I read the program today, I look at the program and I see reimagining education for the innovation era. Teachers, learners, leaders, lessons for the classroom. What school could be, enabling transformation. These are exciting areas, exciting ideas to be discussing in education. And I want to thank you all very much for being part of the conversation today. Please, I always make this plea. Do not be courteous, but do not necessarily be polite in your comments. Feel free to challenge people. Feel free. If something might be inspirational, but actually there's something you want to challenge. That's the way we learn. It's one of the things I tell my students. I tell my pupils, my students, when I teach them, don't accept everything I say. Feel free to challenge me. Let's have a conversation. That way, you will learn better. And wouldn't it be wonderful if you all went away from a conference of education and you learned something? On that, let me introduce the first speaker. It's Tony Wagner, who's a Professor Emeritus of Education at Harvard University and one of the world's foremost thinkers on the topic that brings us today. Thank you all for being part of the conversation. Let's hand over to Tony. Tony.